I'm John Buchanan. Now, what we've done in a number of different videos on this channel is to look at synthesis, the idea of being able to build synthesizer sounds from the components that exist within different types of synthesizer, whether that's kind of subtractive synths or even FM synthesis. We've looked at how it's possible to begin to shape and build sounds. And of course, what we've learned through those videos is that there are different modules within synthesizers which allow us to achieve particular results. And what I want to do today is to shine a little bit of a light on one particular aspect of working with LFOs. LFOs are low frequency oscillators. What they allow us to do is to take a shape and to patch that into different parts of synthesizers. So if we wanted to create a kind of police car siren type of a noise, we might take a sine wave that rose and fell and rose and fell, and we'd patch that into the pitch section of a synthesizer so that the pitch moved and followed that movement. But what I want to do within this video is to look at one particular type of shape and what we can do with that in terms of building a little bit of unpredictability into our synth sounds. And unpredictability is always good. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start within Retro Synth to show you what I mean. So what I've done is to load a sound, which is a kind of version of a preset called Lush Pad. It's a Lush Pad kind of a day. And what I've done is to just slightly sharpen up its attack time so it speaks a little bit more quickly. Anyway, I'll stop talking. It sounds like this. Can you tell that the sun is shining and that we're into spring now? All major chords. Okay, now then, what am I talking about when I talk about LFO movement? Well, the LFO section within Retro Synth is down here. And what it allows me to do is to firstly choose a shape. So if I want a kind of down ramp, I have that option. Similarly, I have an up ramp. I've got a kind of sawtooth wave. I've got a square wave. And what I've got is a kind of half square wave. And we'll see exactly what all of these mean in a moment. So the first thing I'm going to do if I want to use LFO movement of any kind is I'm going to firstly choose the shape that I want. Okay, so far, so straightforward. What I can then do is to choose the speed of movement. And this can either be something which is clocked in hertz, cycles per second. So 6 hertz literally means it will go through an iteration of playing out this down ramp 6 times per second. And if I want it faster than that, I can simply just drag this up using this slider here to the left, or I can click here and just type in the value if I prefer. And alternatively, what I can do is to clock my movement to tempo. In other words, a kind of quantized style rate control, which means that all of the movement will be in time with my track. As the tempo changes for my track, so will the speed of the LFO movement. But so far, effectively, all that really means is that the LFO is kind of happening somewhere, and I haven't decided where I want to kind of patch it into my sound. So let's have a look at how this might work. I'm going to start with a non-synced sort of in hertz speed. And what I'm going to do is to choose this down ramp, and we'll start with a relatively slow one. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to patch this into the filter section. Now, what this means is that this shape is then going to be applied to the tone of this sound. The filter section of a synthesizer controls its tone. So what this is going to do is to open up the cutoff point and then drop it. Open and closed, open and closed, open and closed. It's going to happen over and over again. But it's only going to happen when I start dialing in the LFO amount. And that's a lot of fun. As you can tell, you can always tell because I just get lost in it. So what you can hear very clearly at slow speed is that down ramp and how it's being applied to the sound. Great. So the other thing that we might also want to consider is, okay, well, we've now got that movement, which is coming from this shape. All so far so good. What if what I wanted to do was to have the kind of core of the sound be duller so that the spikes were brighter and more prominent? Well, what that would mean would be taking the cutoff frequency down here to a lower value so that the spikes were brighter, falling to a lower kind of core tonal base for this sound. That would sound like this. And that's nice too. And what you can also hear about this sound is that rather than all of the notes triggering a version of exactly the same LFO movement, in other words, in sync, actually each one starts at its own point. So if I play two notes at exactly the same time, they will sound like they have the same movement on them. I haven't quite hit those in time, but nevertheless. But if I stagger their starts, you can hear that that kind of clattery effect is starting because each new oscillator, each new note, if you like, has got its own LFO movement. So we're starting to understand how LFOs work and what they do and what their shape means. Okay, well, let's just swap that shape for a moment. I'm going to take the core cutoff frequency up a bit, and what I'm going to do is to switch to a square wave. Okay, so a square wave, as its shape suggests, is a kind of on-off kind of a shape. And we can hear that really clearly. You can hear that it's kind of bright, and then it's dull, and then it's bright, and then it's dull. And again, if we slow that down, we'll hear it even more clearly on just one note. Okay, fine. And here is the half version of that. And when I say the half version, you can see that whilst we still get this kind of up spike, the bottom one isn't as significant as in the full square wave shape. Now, what would be really nice would be to say, okay, well, I kind of do want that to be clocked to the tempo of my track so I can switch on sync. And then what I can do is to choose a value which allows the movement to be in time with my track. So if, for example, what I wanted to do was to say, right, I want a kind of version of a square wave movement which is going to be in time with a drum beat, I can have that. So what I've done is to just unmute this little loop that I've got playing in this track. And if I play some notes, they should follow the tempo of this track. Well, that's working. It's quite loud, sorry about the balance, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the problem is that it's completely predictable because the square wave is either bright or it's dull, or it's bright or it's dull, and there's nothing in between. And interestingly, Retro Synth, whilst it's a great place to learn about LFOs in the way that we have so far, doesn't contain the kind of LFO that I think would really benefit a sound like I'm looking for in a track like this, which is to have a random square wave. For that, we need to go to a different synthesizer, and we're going to go to the prettiest synthesizer that exists within Logic, the ES2, with a face only a mother could love. Okay, here we are. What we've got now is the ES2. Now then, what I've done here is also to select a preset, and this sound is called Purity, and it's also a kind of pad, and it sounds like this. And I think we all feel slightly wiped clean by it, which is nice. Okay, so what we've got here is exactly the same principle, that what we want to do is to get some movement into a sound like this using LFOs, which are clocked to tempo, but maybe offer a little bit more unpredictability. Now, the way that modulation assignments are made within the ES2 is in this central matrix area here. And what I'm going to do is to come and find a currently unused target. Well, what I want to do is to make that target the filter section of my synth in exactly the same way that I was in Retro Synth. It's the cutoff frequencies that I'm interested in. Now, when I say frequencies, it's because actually the ES2 contains 2 filters. And that's great. They're working in series, which means that the sound passes through filter 1 and then through filter 2 and then goes on to the amplifier section. So what I'm going to do is to select the cutoff frequency for both filters 1 and 2 so that they are equally affected by the LFO movement I'm about to introduce. So that's the first thing. I'm going to choose that as my target. What I'm then going to do is to choose an LFO as the source which is going to modulate that target. Now, the interesting thing about the LFOs within the ES2 is that there are 2 of those. There's one over here and there's one here, but only LFO2 can be synced to tempo. So what I'm going to do is to select LFO2 as my source, and then what I'm going to do is to turn up the amount that I want LFO2 to affect those 2 filter cutoff points. Okay, so what then happens is I need to choose a speed, a synchronized speed, and I'm going to go, I think, for a quarter note to start with so that we can hear this effect. And for now, for LFO2, at the moment, I'm still using this sawtooth wave shape. So we're going to get a really similar kind of movement to the sorts of movement we were looking at a moment ago. We should hear some gentle introduction of this tone shaping. And sure enough, that's happening. Now, when I look along the line here, I can see that actually LFO2 is doing a number of things. I've set up this assignment, but within this patch, Cutoff 2 is already being affected by LFO2. Well, that's going to be confusing. I'm going to turn that off so that we're not doing that twice. And I can also see that LFO2 is being used to slightly detune the sound, which is why we're getting a little bit of pitch variation. Well, I quite like that, so I'm going to keep that in place. But of course, as I say, what that means is that if I change anything about LFO2, it's going to change for any other things that are being controlled by it, including, it turns out, a little bit of the pan movement as well. Again, fine. But I've talked about random square waves, which means that I need to look down the list of potential shapes and keep going until I find my random square wave, which is this one here. Not easy to see because the icon is tiny, but I think I can probably make it a little bit bigger. And when I do that, this beautiful, beautiful interface gets a little larger, and we have a chance to see that this is a square wave. It's just that the shape of each of the individual parts of that square wave are a different size, a different amplitude. And what's so nice about that is that we start to get unpredictability. So rather than a large lump and then a small one, what we're going to get is lumps of all different types of sizes. Let's choose a different quantized speed for a moment. I'm going to take this up in speed to an 1/8 note. Now you might be thinking, well, where are all the clicks coming from? Well, remember, what's really happening is that the tone now is jumping from, let's say, really bright to really dull. The LFO is controlling how much that happens, and sometimes those steps will be right next to each other and we won't get a click, and sometimes they'll be much more extreme and we do get a click as a result. Quite like the clicks, if I'm totally honest. We'll see how it feels in a little while. But if you don't like the clicks, what you might choose to do would be to go for a random sine wave instead, which is the same idea, that we're going to get a random output shape and a random output amount, but with a kind of softer version of that idea. But I like the delineation, so I'm going to come back to the square waves. Okay, there's one more thing I want to do to this sound before we try it out. I think this little distortion unit that's built into the ES2 might be quite nice too. don't know is whether or not that rather excellent distortion unit is available as a target for the LFO2 movement. I might not be so lucky, although it is part of the amplifier section. Bear with me, I'm going off grid here. Let's choose the amp section for a moment. Let's choose LFO2. Nah, not really feeling that. Okay, fine, we'll go with plan A. I'm just going to stick with a static amount of distortion. Because the distortion is being added after the filter section, that's why we're not hearing the kind of lumpy change that we're getting from the LFO2 movement at sort of attacking the cutoff frequencies as it is. But actually, I think at a really subtle level, this is going to be quite good. Okay, so everything I've been playing, I think, so far is in G, which is going to be very discombobulating when I bring everything else back in, which I think is in B flat. I think that's right. So what we're going to do is to add a little bit of this pad now to this track that I've prepared, just so you can see what happens with the kind of movement we're talking about. I'll open the ES2 so you can see exactly how the sound has been configured, but I'll just pop it over here so that I can add this part underneath it. Okay, here we go. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quantize that in eighth notes. So what I've now got is this kind of pad part, and you can hear that it's moving, and the movement is all coming from this LFO. Now then, as I did within Retro Synth, what I am going to do is to drop the overall cutoff amount so that the sound is a little bit less bright by default. I'm going to have to just experiment with those two filters to work out exactly where that's going to come from. And then what I'm also going to do is to just experiment with the different speeds of the kind of synchronization of this LFO so that I can decide what speed I want this movement to play back at. Okay, so I think I really do like this eighth note movement. So you can see that obviously if I experiment with much slower speeds, the kind of unpredictability of that is even more obvious, because if it turns out that I select a bar, for instance, then of course whatever frequency amount is going to be selected for that bar randomly by the LFO is going to last for 4 whole beats. Whereas here what we definitely get is a kind of sense of that rhythm being sort of put on top of this, but every single time I press play, exactly what happens is going to be unpredictable. The individual amplitude amounts of that LFO are going to vary in completely unpredictable ways. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I really like unpredictability. So square wave LFO assignments are a really good way of being able to get unpredictable movement into your tracks. And hopefully now we understand a little bit more about synthesis too.